Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, we enter the world of John Gotti, the man the world came to know as the Teflon Don. From the buzzing streets of New York to the throne of the Gambino family, his rise was built on charm, strategy, and the kind of power that made his name echo far beyond the city. Before we begin, tell me, what city are you listening from tonight, and what time is glowing on your clock? Settle back, let the story carry you. And if you enjoy these journeys into the hidden empires of history, make sure to subscribe and join us here in the silence. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940, in the Bronx, one of many children in a crowded apartment where money was thin and space even thinner. His father, John Sr., found work where he could. His mother, Fanny, kept the household going. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the family moved more than once, looking for affordable rent and a chance at something steadier. They landed in East New York, Brooklyn, a place where tight-knit blocks could feel like entire worlds. Electricity bills and grocery lists shaped most days. Boys made their own fun in the streets, and the streets taught lessons quickly. By his early teens, John was already chasing that feeling of standing a little taller. He liked nice shoes and a neat haircut even when his pockets were empty. He watched older neighborhood figures who seemed to glide past the rules everybody else followed. They ran gambling, settled disputes, and kept their own sort of order. He saw that people stepped back for them. For a kid who hated being powerless, that was a magnet. School did not hold him. He got in fights, skipped classes, and drifted into a loose crew of street kids who lifted wallets, rolled dice, and hustled. They were bold and loyal to each other in the blunt way teenagers can be. John learned to keep a straight face when police stopped him. He learned when to talk and when to be quiet. By his mid-teens, he racked up minor arrests, the kind that came with a night in a station house and a lecture from a tired judge. None of it calmed him down. He dropped out around 16 and spent days at pool halls and storefronts, where men argued sports and money. Across the river, Manhattan was a skyline. For him, the real gravity was on corners closer to home. In Brooklyn and Queens, there was an established underworld, long before John tried to enter it. After 1957, when the old boss Albert Anastasia was killed and the family fell under Carlo Gambino's steady control, the organization took the Gambino name. It ran on ritual and tradition, initiation vows, strict lines of authority, and the quiet rule that you never spoke to outsiders about what was inside. Crews clustered around social clubs that looked like harmless neighborhood hangouts. A few tables, chairs, coffee, pastries. Behind that simple front, money moved through gambling, bookmaking, loan sharking, labor rackets, and the protection of certain businesses. Turf was shared out and guarded. Disputes were dealt with in-house. John gravitated to Carmine Fatico's people. Fatico was a respected capo who kept his base in Ozone Park, Queens, at a place called the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. The name sounded like a spot where weekend fishermen traded tales, but anyone from the area knew better. A young man who showed dependability there could move up. John ran errands at first. He was quick, eager, and unafraid of risky assignments. He pulled off hijackings from trucks that rolled through the boroughs, grabbed cargo, and learned how to move it. Out at the big airport Idlewild then, later renamed John F. Kennedy, he studied the flow of freight, the schedules, and the weak points where a crate could disappear without a ripple in the paperwork. He was not a loner. He built a tight circle. Angelo Ruggiero was close from early on, street smart and talkative, the kind of friend who filled the air with stories. John's brothers Gene and Peter were nearby as he rose. He also had an associate, Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, who for years was seen as a friend and earner in the crew. These men drank together, made schemes together, and enforced debts together. John's reputation grew for being hands-on, reliable, and willing to collect money personally. That brought both trust from above and attention from the police. In those years, he also tried to build a steady home life. He met Victoria Di Giorgio, a young woman from the neighborhood. They married in 1962 and set up life in Queens. They would have several children, and later, a house in Howard Beach became their base. Even as he tried to bring stability to his family, his work pulled him the other way. Some men avoided heat by keeping low. John liked sharp suits and didn't shy away from looking the part. That flair became a trademark later, But even as a younger man, he was not invisible. Through the 1960s, his crimes escalated from petty hustles to more serious rackets. He was an earner in loan sharking, taking interest payments from borrowers who often had nowhere else to go. He collected on gambling operations, kept bookies in line, and moved stolen goods from cargo thefts. He was arrested multiple times, but cases often fell apart or ended in small sentences. In 1968, a hijacking case finally hit hard. Investigators had built a solid file, and he was convicted in federal court. He went away for a few years. Prison taught him patience and added to his reputation. Inside, he held himself like someone who knew he would matter more when he got out. When he returned around 1971, he found the Bergen crew in good shape and Ozone Park still humming. Carmine Fatico faced legal trouble of his own, and someone had to represent the crew day to day. John was tapped to handle more responsibility. He was not yet inducted a full member of the family, but he was already being tested for bigger things. He organized hijackings at the airport with precision, knowing which shipments were worth the risk and how to unload the goods without drawing extra attention. He kept the bookmaking and loan sharking going, dealt with disputes, and made sure money flowed up to the people above him. In underworld circles, reputation matters more than any resume. John's mix of swagger and focus drew praise from some and concern from others. Old-school figures valued low profiles, while he liked standing out. Yet Aniello Neil Delacroce, the underboss and a man of quiet gravity, took a liking to him. Delacroce operated from the Ravenite social club in Little Italy and served as a mentor to a generation of ambitious soldiers. He taught them discipline and reminded them of old rules. That guidance steadied John as he gathered influence. In 1973, the underworld was shaken when Carlo Gambino's nephew was kidnapped. That act was seen as an assault on the family's authority. The kidnapper, James McBratney, was a tough outlaw who thought he could score by snatching someone connected. It was the kind of affront bosses could not ignore. A team was put together to find McBratney and hold him accountable. John was part of that mission. They tracked McBratney to a Staten Island location. The plan was to grab him quickly in a public place and whisk him away. The grab turned chaotic. Shots were fired. McBratney was killed at the scene. It was not the controlled message the family wanted, and the fallout came fast. The police quickly put together what happened. John was arrested in 1974 for his role. Facing a strong case and sober advice from lawyers, he accepted a plea to a lesser charge tied to his part in the fatal confrontation. He received a sentence measured in years, not decades. He did his time and kept his mouth closed. Inside, that silence and accountability were noticed far beyond the prison walls. He understood that a man's conduct when the pressure is on is the true currency of the life he had chosen. By 1977, he was home again, and what he had earned through silence and steady work paid off. He was formally inducted as a made member of the Gambino family, a ritual that meant more than rank. It marked a point of no return, sealing obligations he had already been living by. Soon after, he was promoted to Capo in the Bergen crew, taking over for the aging Carmine Fatico. In Ozone Park, that promotion put him at the head of a tight, profitable crew. He had soldiers and associates under him, an office of sorts in the social club, and a regular lineup to Delacroce. That crew ran a full range of rackets. They oversaw gambling in bars and back rooms, from numbers to card games. They provided loans at high interest and enforced repayment with pressure. They took a cut from construction jobs and trucking, making sure union disputes went the way certain people wanted them to. They skimmed from cargo and fenced the stolen goods. They protected certain businesses and collected for the protection. None of it looked dramatic day to day. It was a grind of money counting, schedules, sit-downs to iron out problems, quiet punishments when someone broke rules, and always the awareness that federal and state agencies were watching. Law enforcement, for its part, had grown more sophisticated. The FBI's focus on organized crime had tightened after the 1950s, and by the late 1970s, agents were building long-term cases with surveillance, informants, and, increasingly, hidden microphones. In Queens and Brooklyn, they followed cars, noted faces at club doors, and kept logs of who met whom and when. They looked for breaks in loyalty. They tried to flip people with charges or money. They took special interest in the Bergen operation because its captain was now a man who stood out as much as he succeeded. John projected control outside, but home life had its own strain. His wife wanted stability. Children were growing. Neighbors knew who he was. He enjoyed the role of a provider and took pride in it, even as the source of that stability meant risk. On Sundays, he could be the doting father. On Mondays, he could be back to calculating routes for a cargo score. He kept a public face that signaled confidence. He also expected a lot from those around him, inside the crew and in his family. One of the names that appeared around Bergen again and again was Angelo Ruggiero. Angelo was loyal but loose-lipped, a trait that meant warmth among friends in danger when wires might be rolling. John kept him close because loyalty counted deeply. He also worked closely with his brother Gene, who was steady, and with Willie Boy Johnson, who seemed at the time as dependable as anyone. Years later, the truth about Willie Boy's conversations with federal agents would spill out in court documents and news stories. In the late 1970s, though, none of them imagined that a trusted friend had been passing quiet notes to the other side. As the 1970s turned into the 1980s, the Gambino family was massive, the wealthiest of the city's 5 families. Carlo Gambino had died in 1976, and Paul Castellano, a boss who liked business suits and quiet boardrooms, had taken over. Castellano built the family's reach in construction, trucking, and legitimate-seeming companies. He preferred men who kept low, ran their rackets like businesses, and stayed out of the tabloids. John, with his public sheen and rowdy crew, was not Castellano's type. The gap between their styles would grow into a fault line. For now, John followed the chain of command and kept his loyalty with Delacroix, the underboss he admired. With that structure above him and his crew humming below him, John hit a stride. Money came in. His name carried weight. He settled disputes that ran through multiple crews. He sat in on meetings with Delacroix at the Ravenite in Little Italy, traveling from Queens to Manhattan, crossing a quiet line from neighborhood ruler to a citywide player. Underneath the success ran the steady drum of risk, surveillance, informants, ambitious rivals, and the kind of sudden personal loss that no power shields anyone from. That loss would strike in 1980, when a family tragedy shook his household and sparked an anger that would haunt the neighborhood for years. It formed one of the clearest dividing lines in his life, before and after. But as the 1970s closed, that shock had not yet come. He was the captain in Queens, the man at the Bergen door in a perfect suit, stepping into a car while kids on the block stared and memorized the look. He had climbed from a crowded apartment in the Bronx to the inner circle of the largest family in the city, all by breaking laws he believed would never break him. The foundation for what came later, the media spotlight, the courtroom drama, the fights inside the organization, the fall was already laid. The city had noticed him. So had the agencies that chased him. His friends were loyal and loud, his enemies quiet and careful. He believed he could beat any case, calm any feud, and shape his own legend. He was about to test those beliefs in ways he could not fully see. The summer light in Queens can look soft even when life turns hard. In March 1980, John's family lived a regular afternoon until a sound nobody forgets cut through the block. His 12-year-old son Frank was riding a small motorbike near their home in Howard Beach. A neighbor, John Favara, pulled his car out. The collision was sudden. Police called it a tragic accident. No charges were filed. None of that eased the pain inside the Gotti home. Grief settled over them like a heavy coat that would not come off. The neighborhood reacted fast. People talked in whispers. The word accident might have been true, but it felt useless to a father who had always believed he could control outcomes. There were angry moments on the block. Weeks later, in July, Favara vanished after leaving work on Long Island. He was never seen again. Officials opened an investigation, but no case made it to court. Rumors swirled for years about who ordered what and who carried it out. The truth of that disappearance remains unresolved in the official record. The loss that preceded it was not. The scar inside the Gotti family was real and lasting. John went back to the Bergen Club with his jaw set tighter than before. Work became a rhythm, an anchor. He collected from bookmakers, kept loan payments on schedule, and oversaw truck hijackings with the same sharp eye he had before. He also started to think more like a strategist than a street captain. He had influence over soldiers and associates in Queens, and a direct line to underboss Aniello Della Croce in Manhattan. He studied how money moved through unions, especially in construction and trucking, where influence over deliveries, bids, and job sites produced steady income. The Gambino family had long held sway in those sectors, and John increased his crew's slice through pressure and persuasion. The 1980s brought new tools for the government. The RICO law, passed a decade earlier, allowed prosecutors to connect patterns of crimes into a single case and reach higher up the chain. The FBI leaned into surveillance. They planted microphones in social clubs, homes, and cars. They tracked who entered the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club and who took long rides down Cross Bay Boulevard in sedans that circled the same blocks before parking. They photographed handshakes, traced phone calls, and kept lists of names. Within John's orbit, one of the loudest voices belonged to Angelo Ruggiero, a close friend since youth. Angelo liked to talk. He also waded into drug dealing despite strict rules against it. Paul Castellano, who had become boss in 1976 after Carlo Gambino's death, treated narcotics as a bright red line. He believed drug charges brought attention that could cripple the whole organization. He had said many times that anyone who dealt would face severe consequences. Angelo did it anyway, quietly, with a small circle. In the early 1980s, the FBI and federal prosecutors built a narcotics case around him and others linked to the Burgeon crew. They obtained wiretaps on Angelo's home and heard long, rambling conversations about money, arguments, and shipments. Those tapes didn't just threaten Angelo. They risked exposing John and the entire crew to internal discipline and federal charges. Word of the tapes reached Castellano. He demanded transcripts to judge whether anyone had crossed the family's rules. John refused to hand them over, saying it would risk exposing their defenses to law enforcement and endanger people he was bound to protect. Beneath those formal reasons sat a more personal calculus. The tapes included loose talk about leadership and business that could damage him. The standoff between John and the boss hardened day by day. Della Croce, the underboss, stood in the middle, respected by both sides. His health, though, was failing. Cancer was taking him down inch by inch, and with it, the last strong bridge between the conservative approach of Castellano and the raw street style that John represented. Meanwhile, the FBI kept coming. They charged John in a racketeering case tied to the Burgeon crew's activities: illegal gambling, loan sharking, and truck hijacking. Agents tailed him to diners, body shops, and sit-downs with other capos. He fought the case in court and on the street, hiring skilled defense lawyers, probing witnesses for weakness, and keeping his crew steady. He was never shy about his look. He wore tailored suits to court and held himself as if he were walking into a business meeting, not a criminal proceeding. The tabloids noticed. They printed his picture, gave him nicknames, and watched every gesture. Inside the jury box and behind the bench, none of that mattered. Only evidence did. Outside, it built a public image that would follow him for the rest of his life. The pressure mounted across the entire landscape of organized crime. The federal government launched the commission case in 1985, a sweeping prosecution against leaders of multiple families, including Castellano. Agents had bugged the Staten Island home where Castellano spent his time and captured hours of conversations about business, labor deals, and rules. The indictments landed like thunder. Castellano faced trial while trying to run an organization that prized order above all. He demanded the Angelo Ruggiero tapes again. He wanted to punish people he believed had violated cardinal rules. He threatened demotions, house arrests within the internal structure, and even harsher penalties. John and his allies saw the moves as both a moral claim and a political play by a boss who had drifted away from the street and into a world of suits and corporate fronts. Della Croce's condition worsened late in 1985. Men who had always seen him as a steady hand visited him quietly, trying to settle their own worries by paying respect. He passed in early December. The funeral drew figures from every corner of that world, a sober crowd that usually avoided gatherings. Castellano did not attend, citing legal risk and court restrictions. For many loyal to Della Croce, that decision felt like a cold rebuke. Right or wrong, In a culture built on signs and gestures, it landed badly. In whispers at doorways and in cars parked with engines idling, resentment hardened into intent. John met more often with Frank DeChico, a seasoned and practical lieutenant, and with Salvatore Sammy Gravano, a tough earner from Brooklyn known for construction clout. They discussed futures, alliances, and outcomes if the leadership changed. Lines were drawn carefully, risks were weighed. This was not a movie plot. It was a calculation about power, survival, and money in a world without formal elections. If a move were made, it would have to be clean, quick, and final. Anything less would split the family and bring chaos. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and his driver bodyguard, Thomas Bilotti, headed to a meeting in Midtown Manhattan. They planned to discuss internal discipline with capos concerned about the Ruggiero tapes and other disputes. As their car pulled up near a steakhouse on East 46th Street, men approached from the sidewalk. Shots were fired at close range. Castellano and Bilotti fell, and the attackers disappeared into the evening foot traffic and city noise. Witnesses saw flashes and heard shocks, but not much more. Police arrived to a scene already cooling. Word spread through the city in minutes. The boss of the largest family had been cut down in public, on a busy block, during the rush of holiday season. Behind the scenes, many believed John had orchestrated the attack, watching from a nearby car and leaving fast when it was over. He did not claim responsibility. He moved through the next days with care, speaking to allies, framing the violence as a necessary reset after disrespect and dangerous decisions. A meeting of senior figures followed, the kind of gathering that decides whether a strike brings unity or civil war. Enough capos chose stability under new leadership. Frank DeChico took the number 2 role. John sat at the top. The transition was not formal in any way the outside world would recognize, but inside, the signals were clear. The Virgin crew kept its base in Queens, while the new boss based himself at the Ravenite social club in Little Italy, the same spot where he'd long met with Delacroce. His style stamped itself on the operation immediately. He held court in tailored jackets, shook hands with locals on the sidewalk, and made himself visible. Old-timers muttered that bosses should blend into the wallpaper and let money do the talking. John believed street loyalty grew from presence. He wanted to be seen. None of this went unnoticed by law enforcement. The FBI had just watched a central figure in a major case get killed in a public place, and they turned their full attention to the man they believed had benefited most. They doubled surveillance, opened new files, and pushed confidential sources to talk. The tabloids leaned in as well. Reporters camped outside the Ravenite. Camera crews staked out his home in Howard Beach. Photographs of John leaving court, stepping out of a car, or lifting a hand to block a lens ran on front pages. The nickname Dapper Don followed him, a label he disliked but could not shake. With visibility came jurors who walked into court with familiarity, which cut both ways. Inside the organization, John rewarded loyalty and trimmed threats. He promoted men who had stood with him during the break, placed trusted figures over lucrative rackets, and sent calming messages to other families that business would continue. Construction remained a core revenue stream. Unions linked to concrete, carpentry, and trucking felt the pressure of payoffs, controlled bids, and strike timing. Illegal gambling continued in back rooms and bars. Loan sharking never stopped. Club owners who ran unlicensed spots or businesses with labor troubles found help offered at a price. Publicly, John spoke about family and tradition. Privately, he expected tribute on schedule. The government sought leverage wherever it could. In 1985, prosecutors had outed a longtime associate of John's, Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, as a confidential source during a court proceeding. It was a rare, controversial disclosure. Johnson refused witness protection in any meaningful way and tried to continue living in New York. In the halls and on corners, his name turned from a familiar face to a lesson about what happened when trust broke. A few years later, he was ambushed and killed on a Brooklyn street. That slaying, like many of the violent acts tied to this world, showed the cost of betrayal as understood by men inside it. Again, public records document outcomes and charges, but rarely provide full clarity on orders and motives. Silence is a habit in this life. For John, the mid-1980s were a mix of triumph and tightening nets. He had climbed from the Virgin Club to the top of a hierarchy that even its enemies admitted was formidable. He also carried forward problems born before the switch. Angelo's wiretaps, the government's broader campaign, and a city that now watched him as if he were a celebrity. He enjoyed restaurants, took his wife to shows, and moved with a small security team through Manhattan nights. Agents followed, taking notes on who he greeted, who waited on the sidewalk for a word, and who sat with him in the back of a dim club, where the espresso never went cold. Trials and indictments continued to tap his shoulder. He fought a federal case tied to his Queens operation and walked out acquitted, reinforcing a public image of someone who could beat the system. Defense lawyers argued hard on technicalities and the strength of evidence. Jurors listened. Some witnesses were shaky. Investigative mistakes happened, as they do in complex cases. When verdicts came back not guilty, headline writers looked for phrases that matched the moment. The label Teflon would gain traction in the months that followed, but even before that word landed, the sense that charges slid off him had been set. Inside, he was not casual about any of it. He demanded discipline from his crew. He told people who worked for him to stop careless talk and stop bringing drugs near his name. He held long meetings about routes for money, who handled which bookmaking sheets, how to deal with slow payers, and how to keep union leaders pliable without sparking new investigations. He soothed disputes over turf with other families, at times paying to end a standoff rather than risk a war that would draw attention. He could be charming in those sessions, even funny. He could also be cutting when someone failed to deliver, yet he could not control everything. Tapes kept rolling in rooms he trusted. Friends said too much. Enemies smiled politely while waiting for a chance. The new boss stood where every camera could see him and where every federal agent wanted him. In the space of 5 years, he had lost a son, watched a mentor die, helped redraw the top of a powerful organization, and turned into one of the most recognized faces in New York. Power solved some problems and created new ones. The city around him pulsed with its own dramas. A financial rebound, a crime wave that worried families, a nightlife boom that drew crowds to Midtown and downtown. John moved through all of it as if on his own track, living by rules that made sense to his circle and looked upside down to most people. He wanted to be the center of gravity in that world, the man whose word ended arguments. He had the money, the crew, the address, and the nerve to play that role. He also had a federal government ready to put microphones under his table, a press that treated his clothes like news, and a line of prosecutors who believed time was on their side. He liked to say he could take the weight. The next stretch of his life would test that claim in public, in courtrooms packed with reporters, in back rooms where lawyers spread out tapes, and on sidewalks where strangers craned their necks to see him pass. He had climbed. Now he had to hold on. Power came with a target on his back. In the spring of 1986, a blast tore through the quiet of a Brooklyn block and took Frank DeChico, the trusted number 2 who had helped steady the change at the top. Investigators believed rival leaders approved the strike as payback for the Midtown hit on Paul Castellano. The message was plain. The new order would not go unchallenged. Gotti tightened his circle, added more lookouts, varied routes, and watched meetings with extra care. He grieved the loss and pushed on. The organization could not pause, not in that world. He soon elevated other veterans to key roles. Joseph "Joe" Piney Armoni, a respected earner with years of experience, rose in rank. Frank Locascio became a constant presence. Salvatore "Sammy" Gravano, a moneymaker with strong ties to construction and unions, moved closer to the center. Courts kept pace with the street. Old cases tied to the Virgin crew and newer charges related to gambling, loan sharking, and extortion came in waves. One federal racketeering trial ended in his favor, and headlines seized on the image. Suits, smiles, and not guilty verdicts turned into a brand. Papers labeled him with words that suggested nothing stuck. That coverage annoyed agents and prosecutors who had spent years building files. It also annoyed some inside the life who felt attention was poison. Gotti liked to project calm. He walked out of court with his chin up and told anyone who asked that his wins came from weak cases and good lawyers. Years later, cooperators and court records would claim a juror was corrupted in one of those acquittals. At the time, none of that had been proven in open court, and the verdict stood. He liked the Ravenite social club as his base, a small spot in Little Italy where the coffee was strong and the door was watched. He stepped onto the sidewalk and greeted locals, chatted with shopkeepers, and let the cameras catch him in perfect ties. Old-line bosses had avoided street attention. He believed presence built loyalty. He stayed visible in Howard Beach, too, where the family home sat on a quiet block. That mix of neighborhood familiarity and downtown showmanship made him a daily item in New York tabloids. Reporters waited across the street. Photographers timed his exits. Television trucks idled on corners. Business did not slow. Gambling dens, sports betting, numbers, and card games needed steady hands. Loan collectors visited on schedule. Construction rackets remained a prize. Crews steered contracts, fixed bids, and managed deliveries through pressure on foremen and union officers. Trucking and concrete still paid, especially on big projects, where controlling site access could stall a job for a day or a week and cost a builder dearly. When disputes broke out over who would get a slice of a job, sit-downs settled them. Sometimes the answer was a new split, sometimes a warning. The point was order, the kind defined by the family's rules, not the city's. A case out of Manhattan labor circles added heat. John O'Connor, a tough union figure, had tangled with people linked to the Gambinos over a damaged restaurant. Months later, he was ambushed and wounded. Detectives built a case that pointed toward Gotti as the one who demanded payback. The state tried him. Defense lawyers attacked the witnesses and motives. He was acquitted. He walked out smiling as the press shouted questions. He called it a clean win. Authorities saw another example of how hard it was to land a lasting result against him. Meanwhile, the federal push widened beyond a single office or family. Prosecutors took on the so-called Windows program in city housing, exposing a cartel that rigged contracts to replace apartment windows across the boroughs. Investigators said members of several families, including key Gambino figures, controlled the flow of bids and skimmed millions. Convictions followed for many involved. Armoni, who had been lifted into leadership after DeCicco's death, was among those taken off the street by a federal sentence. Gotti adjusted again, slotting Frank Locascio into a higher role and leaning even more on Gravano in construction and union matters. The attention brought danger of a different kind. In 1985, a courtroom disclosure had exposed Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, an associate close to Gotti for years, as a confidential source for federal agents. Johnson refused to disappear into protection. In 1988, he was shot and killed in Brooklyn. Detectives treated it as a classic retaliation for betrayal. The lesson traveled fast in that world. Talk to the government and expect the worst. Publicly, Gotti said little. Privately, he used the moment to remind his circle of the cost of loose lips. Other internal moves, known mostly through later testimony, hardened his reputation as a decisive leader. Robert DiBernardo, a businessman with wide ties in the adult entertainment trade who had earned for the family, disappeared in 1986. Years later, Gravano told jurors that Gotti approved that elimination after questions about loyalty. The case had no body and no direct courtroom resolution against Gotti for that act, but the allegation added to a picture of a boss who would not ignore doubts about anyone near the center. Relations with other families stayed complicated. The bold Midtown hit on Castellano had crashed through older protocols, and some leaders never forgot it. Investigators believe the fatal bombing of DeCicco came from a partnership between powerful rivals who wanted to strike back without sparking a full-on war. After that, everyone moved carefully. Talks between families kept the peace in most cases. Money flowed across lines when it served common interests. Still, grudges simmered. Everybody knew where the old fault lines ran. The FBI turned the Ravenite into a full-time project. Agents tried to plant microphones inside the club more than once. Hidden devices failed, got discovered, or picked up too little because music or traffic noise washed out the words. The team adjusted tactics. They watched patterns, especially the way Gotti and his inner circle left the front room and went upstairs to a private apartment for more sensitive talks. After long planning, agents placed a device in that apartment with a court order. The recordings captured long conversations involving Gotti, Locascio, and Gravano about discipline, leadership, and money. Prosecutors later argued those tapes undercut the Teflon legend by letting jurors hear the boss in his own voice, discussing the very conduct they wanted to prove. Before those tapes surfaced publicly, Gotti kept living the high-wire act. He hosted holiday parties at clubs, slipped into restaurants after the dinner rush, and spent time at home with his wife and children. He looked after friends' families when men went to prison, sent envelopes to widows, and paid hospital bills. Those gestures meant something in that code. He expected loyalty back in strict form, dues on time, silence with outsiders, deference in disputes. He could be warm, even playful, with people he liked. He could turn cold with anyone he thought was leaning on his name without delivering. In 1988 and 1989, he felt the squeeze from every side. The city's tabloid culture gave him attention he had cultivated, but it never turned off. Agents filmed him walking, waving, laughing, and then paired those clips with transcripts from other cases. Officials in Washington pointed to the campaign against structured crime as a model of steady pressure. New indictments hit capos and soldiers in several boroughs. Some pleaded, some fought. A few began to cooperate. Each turncoat brought stories and tapes. Prosecutors tested every claim, matched dates, and built new files. Around him, the organization kept paying bills. Construction remained the engine. Unlicensed clubs kicked up money. Bookmakers paid weekly. Trucking bosses knew who to call if a site slowed down. A major part of the work was conflict management. Keeping crews from stepping on each other, keeping allied families from feeling shorted, and keeping street beefs from turning into something that drew more agents. Gotti used sit-downs, fines, and when he thought it necessary, demotions. Gravano handled many of those meetings, using his reputation as a doer to enforce decisions. Locascio served as the steady counselor who kept records in his head and made sure money moved upward properly. There were missteps. Angelo Ruggiero's earlier wiretaps had not vanished. Even as Angelo battled illness, those recordings hovered. A cloud that never stopped threatening rain. Gotti kept Angelo close, but moved him out of sensitive spaces. He told his people, again and again, to stop any hint of drug dealing under his name. He knew that narcotics cases gave prosecutors leverage, and he did not want that leverage inside his house. By late Escalating, investigators felt ready. The upstairs tapes at the Ravenite, plus testimony from cooperators and years of surveillance, gave them a broad racketeering case that included murders, extortion, gambling, loan sharking, union corruption, and obstruction. They pointed to the Midtown double killing of Castellano and Thomas Bilotti as the pivotal act that sealed his rise. They added the DiBernardo allegation, the O'Connor retaliation, and other internal killings recounted by witnesses. They framed the case not as a set of isolated events, but as a pattern. An enterprise guided by a boss who made rules, collected tribute, set punishments, and controlled lucrative industries through fear and favor. On December 11, 1990, agents waited near the Ravenite as evening fell. Gotti arrived for the usual round of greetings and private talks. Gravano and Locascio were there too. When the moment came, the arrest team moved in. Agents announced themselves. There was no chase, no struggle, just a quiet close to a long watch. They took the three men into custody and drove them to a federal office. News spread within minutes. Cameras rushed to Lower Manhattan. Reporters pressed microphones toward doors, hoping for quotes. None came. The legend of cases sliding off him met a set of tapes and a cooperating witness list that prosecutors believed would hold. Inside the cells, the mood shifted from street theater to calculation. Lawyers arrived, asked for discovery, and began to map out defense strategies. Gotti projected calm. He had beaten cases before. He believed jurors listened when defense lawyers showed gaps. He trusted his presence. He also understood that the recordings, if admitted, posed a new kind of problem. Words spoken in rooms that once felt safe now sat on government reels. Gravano, who had been closer to him than almost anyone in recent years, faced his own choices as the evidence landed. The government made no secret that it wanted someone from the inner circle to flip. The men who had built their lives on silence had to decide whether to keep that vow under the heaviest pressure they had ever faced. On the sidewalks outside, crowds gathered as if for a premiere. Some people waved. Others shouted insults. Most just watched. Drawn by the mix of crime, fame, and city mythology, agents carried boxes of tapes and files through doors while cameras clicked. The Dapper Don label faded, replaced by headlines about recordings from inside a trusted apartment and the question of whether a boss could still beat the government in an age of hidden microphones. That winter marked a turning point. The years of Rise, the Midtown hit, the showmanship on Mulberry Street, the acquittals, the reassignments after bombings and convictions, everything flowed into a single case. Court dates were set. Motions flew. The defense attacked the legality of the bugs and the credibility of cooperators. Prosecutors answered with transcripts and witnesses who had lived inside the machine and now described it piece by piece. The jury would have to decide which story to believe. The image of a man targeted by overzealous authorities, or the evidence of a leader who had run an outlaw enterprise from a storefront in Little Italy. Concrete walls run on a different clock. In early 1991, John sat in a federal lockup in Manhattan, meeting rooms bright with fluorescent light, pens scratching on legal pads. Bail was denied. The government laid out a sweeping case: racketeering, murder conspiracies, extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, obstruction, and control of unions tied to construction and trucking. They said the recordings from a small apartment above the Ravenite captured him as the one who set rules and punishments. The defense said the tapes were taken unlawfully and that informants were chasing deals. Judges weighed motions. The city watched. One blow landed before the jury ever heard a word. The court removed his longtime lawyers, arguing they might become witnesses because of their presence on some recordings. It was a shock to lose the familiar team that had guided him through earlier fights. He hired Albert Krieger, a seasoned defense lawyer from Miami, and built a new bench around him. The prosecution team, led by a driven federal attorney from Brooklyn, kept filing exhibits, transcripts of meetings, surveillance logs, and witness lists that stretched page after page. Inside the jail, the co-defendants considered their futures. Frank Locascio projected calm, the quiet lieutenant, who had always preferred the back room to a spotlight. Salvatore Sammy Gravano, who had stood beside Gotti at the top and managed much of the construction money, studied the tapes and the charges. Weeks turned into months. In the fall, Gravano made a choice that shook the underworld. He agreed to cooperate with the government. He sat with prosecutors for hours, walking them through years of business, discipline, alliances, and killings. He admitted his own crimes and placed Gotti at the center of many decisions. In return, he sought leniency and a fresh start under protection. That decision crossed a line most in that world saw as uncrossable. Word leaked fast. On the sidewalk outside the courthouse, reporters whispered the name Gravano, like a plot twist. Inside, the government reshaped its case to feature him as the main witness, backed by the Ravenite recordings and the testimony of agents, union figures, and former associates. The defense adjusted too, readying cross-examination that would hammer at credibility. You admit to violent crimes? You took a deal to save yourself? You will say anything the government wants. The trial began in early 1992 in a packed Brooklyn courtroom. The judge took care with jury selection, aware of the attention that clung to every mention of Gotti. Jurors were sworn and promised protection from outside pressure. Opening statements framed two pictures. The prosecution said the evidence would show a structured enterprise, with Gotti as boss, directing acts that kept money flowing and challengers quiet. The defense said prosecutors had stitched together gossip, guesses, and the words of a man who had already admitted to grave crimes and now wanted freedom at any cost. Prosecutors started with the tapes. Jurors listened to muffled conversations from the small apartment above the club. They heard voices discussing discipline, money, and the removal of people who disrespected leadership. No single sentence did all the work, but taken together, the recordings gave jurors a sense of command and intent at the top. Agents explained how the bug was planted with a warrant, how they changed batteries, and how they kept logs that matched dates, cars, and faces. The defense attacked the sound quality and context, saying snippets were ambiguous, and that translators or agents might be hearing what they wanted to hear. Then Gravano took the stand. He wore a suit, spoke steadily, and for days answered questions about the inner life of the organization. He said he had sat in rooms where murders were approved, including the December 1985 attack on Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti that cleared the way for a leadership change. He told jurors about Robert DiBernardo, a businessman who fell out of favor, about Liborio Milito, a longtime associate marked after internal doubts, and about Louis Di Bono, a soldier who resisted a direct order to appear and was eliminated in 1990. He said union jobs and major concrete contracts were steered through threats and payoffs, and that weekly envelopes moved up the chain on a schedule that never slipped. The defense cross-examined hard. They walked him through each deal with prosecutors, every benefit he hoped to receive, every contradiction in earlier interviews. They reminded jurors of his admissions. Involvement in many killings, decades of crimes, and a willingness to talk now that prison terms loomed. Gravano did not flinch. He repeated that he was telling the truth now, that the enterprise worked as he described, and that Gotti set direction, approved removals, and promoted him after Frank DeCicco's death to keep construction money on track. Other witnesses filled in the edges, agents with surveillance maps, union officers who described bid rigging on city housing windows contracts, bookmakers who paid weekly, and insiders who handled loan sharking or numbers in Queens and Brooklyn. The government presented the case as a web. Each strand tape, witness, ledger, photograph, reinforced the rest. The defense called character witnesses, challenged the legal basis for the tapes, and asked the judge to strike portions of testimony as unreliable. They told jurors that fame had made their client a target, that earlier acquittals showed prosecutors overreached, and that the government now relied on a self-confessed killer to salvage a case. Closing arguments returned to first principles. Prosecutors said racketeering law existed to handle exactly this kind of structure. A crew that ran gambling, loans, labor rackets, and ordered violence to protect profits and power. They listed the racketeering acts, including the killings of Castellano, Bellotti, DiBernardo, Milito, and Di Bono, along with extortion, illegal gambling, and obstruction. They replayed clips in which a voice the jury had been told was Gotti discussed disobedience and consequences. The defense said none of those acts had been proved beyond reasonable doubt against their client, that Gravano's testimony was bought, and that the tapes were vague at best. The jury deliberated for days while cameras kept vigil outside. On April 2, 1992, they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Headlines flipped the nickname. Teflon was declared gone. Reporters called him the Velcro Don, saying everything had finally stuck. In June, the judge imposed life without the possibility of parole and a hefty fine. Frank Locascio received life as well. The court said the case had shown a leader at the center of an enterprise that profited through unlawful means and maintained control through intimidation and violence. Appeals followed, challenging the removal of defense lawyers, the admissibility of tapes, and the weight of Gravano's testimony. The convictions were upheld. Higher courts declined to intervene. He was transferred to the federal penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, a high-security prison known for strict controls. The Bureau of Prisons kept him under tight restrictions to limit communication with the outside. Visits were monitored. Calls were few. Letters were screened. Even so, investigators believed he tried to keep influence alive by passing messages through approved visitors, discussing money flows, and leadership questions. Over time, the rules grew tighter. Administrators wanted to cut any line that could carry orders back to New York. On the street, a transition took shape. His eldest son, John A. Gotti, known as Junior, took on a larger role, acting as a bridge between remaining capos and the absent boss. Trusted relatives, including Peter Gotti, helped manage day-to-day matters. There were sit-downs to reset splits on rackets. There were moves to calm disputes that flared after the conviction. Law enforcement kept pressure on, charging soldiers and captains across several boroughs. Surveillance didn't stop just because the boss was behind bars. If anything, it intensified, as agents watched to see who filled gaps and how money moved without the old center in place. The press still chased him. Magazine writers profiled the man who had courted cameras and now lived in a concrete box. Some reports focused on routines: exercise in a small room, legal mail in neat stacks, and visits with family behind glass. Others described tension inside the prison, where a famous inmate attracted attention, both curious and hostile. He was disciplined more than once for breaking rules about communication. Each infraction led to months in a more isolated unit. Gravano's path also stayed in the news. After testifying, he received a deal that spared him a life term. He entered witness protection, then later left it, moved west, and was arrested years after for unrelated drug trafficking activity. That second fall, far from New York, made new headlines and fueled debates about the cost and wisdom of cutting deals with violent insiders. For Gotti, the betrayal of a man brought close to the top never stopped stinging. In monitored conversations with visitors, he cursed Gravano by name and called him a liar who had saved himself by inventing stories. Court rulings, however, had already accepted those stories as credible, especially when matched against tapes. Aging and confinement worked on him. He had always prided himself on presence, crisp suits, street greetings, a command of rooms. In prison, the uniform was the same for everyone, and days crawled. He held to habits: grooming, posture, measured speech when speaking with guards or counselors. Family visits mattered. His wife, Victoria, remained steady. Children came when they could, navigating security lines and the awkwardness of conversations through a partition. The distance between the life he built and the life he now lived was a daily fact no swagger could hide. Appeals and post-conviction motions ran their course through the mid-1990s. Lawyers tried every avenue: ineffective assistance claims, challenges to wiretap procedures, and attacks on the use of cooperating witnesses. None found traction. Judges wrote that the evidence was overwhelming. The record of recordings, surveillance, and testimony, they said, supported the verdicts well. For the first time since he had risen in Queens, Gotti faced a reality he could not change with charm, money, or force. He was a lifer. Illness crept in near the decade's end. A diagnosis of throat cancer led to surgery at the Federal Medical Center in Missouri. He returned to Marion, then back to the hospital as the disease advanced. Still, for a time, he tried to project strength in letters and brief calls. He told family to keep going, told old friends to mind their business and avoid the mistakes that had brought so much heat. On the outside, the organization he once led adjusted again, with relatives shouldering burdens and investigators continuing to peel away at operations in construction, trucking, gambling, and loans. By the mid-1990s, another shift in public perception had taken hold. The flamboyant sidewalk figure had become a cautionary tale. Documentaries, books, and newspaper retrospectives treated the case as a turning point in the modern campaign against organized crime. RICO, long criticized as too broad, looked effective. Hidden microphones, once rare, were now proven tools that could pierce the secrecy of social clubs and apartments above them. The fall of the man who had stood smiling on courthouse steps sent a message that leaders could be reached if patience and technology lined up. Still, the human story threaded through the public one. A kid from a crowded Bronx home had climbed into the role he had wanted since he saw older men rule corners. He had made money, enforced rules, punished rivals, and invited attention. That attention had helped build a legend and helped build the case that ended him. In the end, the lights were off, the cell door was closed, and the routines of a federal facility replaced lady-night dinners, sidewalk greetings, and the hum of a corner club. Prison shortened the horizon but not the reach of his name. In the mid-1990s, he woke to the same count. The same slot of yard time, the same clatter of carts in concrete corridors. Guards checked the door. A counselor noted his moves. He kept his posture, spoke in measured tones, and worked within the rules when he had to. He tried to keep some influence alive with coded nods and small talk and careful phrases during approved visits. Administrators watched closely and tightened controls when they sensed the old command voice pushing through the walls. A sanction here, a stint in a more restricted unit there. The message was simple. Whatever his status had been outside, inside he was inmate number, not boss. On the street, his absence left a gap that relatives and loyalists tried to fill without sparking chaos. His eldest son, John A. Gotti, stepped forward as an acting figure. Young compared to the men who had grown gray at social clubs but carrying the last name that made doors open. He dealt with capos who had known him as a kid. He handled sit-downs over bookmaking routes, sports betting action, and shares from construction and trucking. Tribute still moved up. Old patterns in labor pressure on foremen, control of deliveries, and negotiation with union officials kept producing steady income. The family had survived leadership changes before by valuing continuity. He tried to prove he understood the same playbook. Law enforcement did not ease up. Federal and state offices in New York broadened their cases, targeting labor racketeering that had been a money engine since the 1970s. Teams used cooperating witnesses, financial records, and undercover tapes to expose fixed bids, intimidation of contractors, and skims from housing jobs. The Windows investigations had already shaken the system, and offshoots kept moving. Prosecutors charged union officers who took envelopes, foremen who looked away, and collectors who delivered demands. A capo could no longer assume a sit-down solved everything. There might be a recorder on the table. His brothers felt the heat too. Gene, a steady earner and enforcer for years, had already gone away on a heroin case back in the late 1980s, the kind of narcotics conviction that brought long terms and shut doors. Angelo Ruggiero, the talkative childhood friend whose wiretaps had fueled so much internal stress, had died of illness before he could face full trials. Peter Gotti, loyal and methodical, took on more responsibility as the 1990s wore on. Running point on day-to-day matters while visiting rooms and monitored calls set the rhythm of consultation with the man in Marion. The family's leadership, once expressed in public handshakes outside Mulberry Street storefronts, now moved through schedules of visiting hours and hurried exchanges at payphones. The press recalibrated its lens. In the late 1980s, it had gloried in sidewalk shots, bright ties, and chin-you-up posture. By the middle of the next decade, headlines turned toward the architecture of law enforcement success. Reporters explained RICO in plain language. They described how a single enterprise case could connect deadly orders, union pressure, gambling revenue, and obstruction into a pattern that jurors understood. Documentaries gathered retired agents and prosecutors to talk about patience, months to place a microphone, years to collect useful tapes, and even longer to persuade insiders to testify. The old code had not vanished, but exceptions had multiplied. Inside Marion, he lived that change in intimate detail. Non-privileged visits could be monitored. Conversations over a cafeteria table could end up in a report. He kept his anger close to the vest when he heard the name of the cooperator whose testimony had cut the strongest line in the case. He still told family he would fight appeals, that courts got things wrong, that he had been condemned by a witness who saved himself. Judges, however, kept writing rulings that called the evidence substantial and well corroborated. Time, the thing he had always controlled with schedules and discipline, now controlled him. By 1998, another reckoning arrived. Doctors found a tumor in his throat. He left Marion under guard for surgery at the Federal Medical Center in Missouri, the place where the Bureau sent inmates with serious medical needs. For a while, he showed the same stubborn resilience he had carried on the street. He did the treatments, took the medications, and tried to keep his voice strong during visits. Illness has its own timetable. The disease returned. Trips between Marion and the hospital grew more frequent. Calls were shorter. Letters felt heavier. The public saw only the brief lines in newspapers. A diagnosis, a procedure, a status report. Family saw the reality. A man who had once treated fatigue like an enemy, now pacing his day by what his body would permit. Outside, his eldest son's run at the top ended in indictment. In 1998, a federal case charged John A. Gotti with racketeering acts tied to gambling, loans, labor pressure, and extortion, including money taken from night spots and adult venues. Facing years of potential exposure and evidence that included recorded meetings and insider accounts, he chose to plead in 1999. He admitted to racketeering and received a prison term measured in years rather than decades. He also publicly said he was stepping away from the life. Whether that statement was absolute truth or a strategic line became a question for later years, but it closed a chapter. The father in Marion, the son on his way to a federal facility, control moving again to others. With Junior gone, Peter Gotti took on a larger share. He projected the opposite of sidewalk flash: quiet clothes, quiet talk, a worker's demeanor. Investigations followed him, as they had followed anyone brave or stubborn enough to claim leadership in that period. Federal indictments in the early 2000s accused him of racketeering that included control over waterfront unions and attempts to reach across the country to punish the old cooperator who had testified against his brother. Other cases reached into entertainment and nightlife, alleging attempts to extract money from a film star linked to a past business associate. Trials and convictions piled up. He eventually received long sentences that would keep him in federal custody for years. The family, once called the city's most powerful, found itself led by men who spent more time with lawyers than with crews on corners. In those same years, the federal witness who had delivered the crucial testimony against John stumbled badly. After serving a reduced sentence and leaving protection, he moved west and got arrested in a new case involving a drug ring that targeted club scenes. That arrest, far from New York, reignited debate about the bargains at the heart of modern organized crime prosecutions. How much mercy should the state trade for information, and what it meant when a cooperator promised reform, but fell back into crime. For the man in the medical ward, it was another bitter note in a song he refused to sing. He saw betrayal. Courts saw credibility backed by tapes. The gap never closed. As his health declined, he held to routines that kept a small sense of dignity. He shaved carefully. He straightened his clothes. He listened more than he spoke in visits, saving his voice. Conversations circled the same themes. Family milestones he would miss, legal updates that changed nothing, memories of old mentors and old blocks. He spoke of Aniello Della Croce with respect, of Frank DeCicco with sadness, of Gene with brotherly pride. He told his children to keep steady, to stay clear of any impulsive move that could draw them back into cycles he could no longer influence. In June 2002, he died at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield at 61. The disease that had been checked for a time had finished its course. News alerts lit up the same city that had once watched him parade past cameras. The tone was different now. No nicknames in the lead sentence, fewer jokes about suits, more lines about a period of New York history closing for good. Television trucks went to Howard Beach and to the old social club block, searching for faces that remembered him. Police put restrictions in place to avoid a spectacle. The family held a wake that drew large crowds and a quiet burial at a Queens cemetery where other relatives rested. There were no triumphal speeches, no microphones for grieving relatives on the church steps. Years earlier, he had sought the bright light by choice. In death, the light dimmed by design. What remained on paper was stark. A life sentence, fines, forfeitures, appeals denied. What remained in the city was more complicated. A memory of a man who ran his days with steel and who believed presence equaled power, and a record of harm documented in courtrooms where jurors listened to tapes and decided guilt. The organization he led did not vanish, but its shape changed. Pressure on unions broke profitable structures. The old concrete club system that steered big urban jobs, the tax on trucking terminals, the quiet take from lady-night gambling, none disappeared entirely. But none returned to the old heights. Other figures rose and fell, as they always had, but the era when a single name could command the front page and a block full of eyes had ended. In the years that followed, his family lived with both legacy and law. Junior came home from his first sentence, then faced new federal charges in the mid-2000s that alleged he had continued to guide rackets after saying he had retired. Those trials ended in multiple mistrials when juries could not agree. Prosecutors eventually dropped the case. He went on television shows, gave interviews, and said he had left the life behind. Writers argued over how much to believe. Some saw a man trying to protect his children from a cycle that had taken him and his father down. Others saw a skilled public face. The brother Peter served long terms and struggled with illness before dying in custody many years later. Gene finished his sentence and returned quietly to Queens as an older man, watched by agents who knew the past rarely stays in the past. Movies and books kept the story alive in another way. Journalists wrote deep dives into the cases. Former agents published memoirs about the Ravenite tapes and the long surveillance that made them possible. Filmmakers cast famous actors to play him, to recreate the sidewalk scenes and courtroom stairs. Some projects treated him as a symbol of an old New York, others as a study in hubris. Families of victims, union members who had paid extra for years, and small business owners who had felt the pinch, watched those portrayals with their own scars in mind. The best works tried to hold two truths at once. A man of charisma who valued loyalty and a leader of an enterprise that profited by breaking the law and squeezing people who could not push back. What lessons the city took depended on where you stood. For law enforcement, the case proved patience and technology could pierce a culture of silence. For young men on blocks that once idolized polished shoes and fast cars, the ending cautioned against mistaking fear for respect. For his family, the story was personal. A husband and father who loved his own and made sure bills were paid, and a man whose choices brought relentless scrutiny, trials, prison, and a grave decades before most men planned to stop working. The long arc from a Bronx childhood to a federal ward in Missouri flattened out into dates on a timeline: 1,940, 1,977, 1,985, 1,992, 2002. The spaces between those dates held a life spent pushing for control. Control of money, of crews, of a public image, even of the hours in a cell. He believed he could win by force of will. For years, that belief seemed to match reality. In the end, the forces he had long tested law, time, illness won. The city kept moving. Because cities do. Storefront shutters rolled up in the morning. Families hurried kids to school. A social club became a bakery, then a boutique. On some nights, older men still told stories over coffee about the days when a certain name could make a room fall silent. Then the bell above the door would ring, someone would step in for a pastry, and the evening would go on. Cities keep their own archives. Even after a funeral, people revisit old corners, replay the news footage, and ask what really happened inside rooms that never had cameras. John's name lived in that echo. After the burial, investigators finished reports, authors pitched books, and neighbors who had watched him step into sedans told their versions across kitchen tables. The story kept unspooling because it tied together pieces of New York that don't often sit in one frame. A working-class climb, an outlaw enterprise that touched unions and job sites, a media machine eager for a face, and a prosecution model built on patience, technology, and the turn of an insider. Looking back from the calm of years later, you can trace the mechanics more clearly. At the top of his run, John tried to fuse two styles that rarely coexist for long: street visibility and tight control. He liked to shake hands at the club door, and also to decide who got a slice of a concrete pour in Midtown. That visibility made him the easiest target in the city for reporters who knew where to aim a lens. The control piece depended on rules enforced quietly, through sit-downs, demotions, and, when he believed it necessary, fatal orders carried out by people who understood consequences without needing extra words. Those twin instincts, public presence and private discipline, took him higher than most, and then amplified every mistake. The code he lived by had lines that seemed firm and then turned porous under pressure. He had long preached against drug dealing around his name, a stance that matched older leaders who feared narcotics charges like a fire that jumped barriers. Yet the tapes from his friend's home in Queens caught long, casual chatter about shipments and money. The mountain of recordings lifted in court did not show him running a drug ring, but those wires opened the door to internal demands for punishment, and then to the chain of friction with a boss who viewed loose talk as an invitation to ruin. That friction, sparked by Angelo's mouth and the government's microphone, became the fuse that lit December on East 46th Street and rewrote the leadership chart. It also pushed law enforcement to refine a method. Agents had learned, painfully, that the front rooms of social clubs were theater. The coffee, cards, and sports talk were real enough, but sensitive decisions moved upstairs or around the block. So they learned to look for the second stage, the apartment above a storefront where windows stayed closed, or a short walk to a hallway without music. The Ravenite operation worked because it honored that pattern. The bug sat not in the club, but where the real conversations happened, above a dress shop in a small, rarely rented space. When jurors later listened, they heard not a voiced confession, but the cadence of a boss setting rules, speaking about discipline, and drawing lines no one in that circle dared cross. The point of the tapes was mood and authority, not drama. Old cases regained color when later testimony filled in gaps. The 1,987 acquittal that fed the nothing sticks image came under a darker light when prosecutors in the 1,992 trial said a juror in that earlier case had been corrupted. Cooperators claimed cash changed hands and the panel was compromised. The acquittal remained on the books, but the legend attached to it cracked. To the public, those claims explained the contrast. How a man could beat thin cases and one fatally compromised jury, then fall hard when microphones and a top lieutenant aligned. Inside the organization, decisions that seemed shocking from the outside followed a logic designed to keep order among crews that prize strength. Gravano told jurors that men like Robert DiBernardo, Louis Di Bono, and Louis Milito fell not because of random grudges, but because leaders convinced themselves that disloyalty, disobedience, or dangerous talk would, if left unchecked, ripple outward. Whether each accusation was fair or not mattered less in that world than the signal sent. A culture built on silence and tribute processed risk by removal. For families of the dead, that meant grief without closure. For investigators, it created cold cases that depended on the rare shift when an insider chose to talk. The combative relationship with other families also had its own timelines and semantics. Old-line bosses had operated by careful balance, avoiding public spectacles that drew heat on everyone. The Midtown hit on a sitting leader broke that balance. Retaliation arrived months later on a Brooklyn block, when an explosion ended Frank DeChico's life. Detectives and later cooperators credited figures from rival families with authorizing that strike, using a device instead of a team on foot to keep distance. After that, diplomacy stiffened. Sit-downs between families became exercises in avoiding runaway escalation. Money could smooth hard feelings. Pride could not. John tried to project strength while avoiding broader conflict, a narrow path that required constant management of senior figures who had their own ambitions and grievances. The union rackets that anchored revenue under him were at once subtle and obvious. On paper, construction firms bid on jobs and won contracts by the numbers. In practice, a club of approved companies and connected intermediaries decided who would take which share of a project and at what markup. Pressure landed not just on executives but on foremen who controlled gates, on truckers who scheduled deliveries, and on inspectors who signed off on phases. Investigations later mapped these gears with witness accounts, ledger entries, and expert testimony. The famous faces on front pages mattered less to cases than a foreman's check stub or a union treasurer's notebook with initials and percentages. John's influence sat at the top of that chain. He promoted people who could keep such systems smooth and punish those who risked the flow. A different part of the story lived in the neighborhood where he raised his family. Howard Beach had its own rhythms, its own disagreements, and, in the mid-1980s, its own flashpoints unrelated to the underworld. A notorious racial attack drew headlines and protests. John stayed at a distance from that public controversy, understanding that extra attention of any kind threatened the quiet he wanted on his block. He worked to keep police focus limited to him, and not to the place where his wife shopped and his children played. Neighbors saw him as the man who nodded hello and made sure holiday lights went up on time. That duality family man on the block, feared figure downtown, ran through every telling of his life. In courtrooms, the government's approach turned systematic. Agents like the supervisor who ran the Gambino squad in Manhattan built teams that tracked cars, tails, phone calls, and visitor logs. They wrote down the names of doormen who held doors, waiters who greeted certain groups, and drivers who idled where a boss liked to stop. They sent in cooperating witnesses to record meetings about union issues, a housing contract dispute, or a payment schedule on sports betting. Each piece looked small alone. Together, they formed timelines that made sense to jurors unversed in the life's jargon. The shift from street busts to enterprise cases meant prosecutors could show a pattern that lasted years and crossed boroughs, instead of resting their case on a single incident with a nervous eyewitness. The media's role stayed complicated. Early coverage created a mythology that he both disliked and used. The photographs of silk ties and sidewalk salutations fed a sense of invincibility among some in his circle. They also enraged officials who did not want to see unlawful power adorned like celebrity. Later, the same outlets chronicled the methodical unraveling. The upstairs microphone, the taped complaints about a soldier who failed to follow orders, the whispered anger at a friend's loose talk, the jury that heard voices and chose prison. After his death, the storytelling industry kept going. A Medieval TV film in the 1990s, documentaries with retired agents, a glossy feature film years later, the portrayals varied in quality and tone. Families of victims pushed back against any romantic treatment. His relatives defended his memory as a man who loved his own and insisted that the state's witnesses lied to save themselves. The public consumed it all, as the public always does, through the filters it prefers. His children built lives under that glare. A television series followed his daughter and grandsons, showing a household that mixed ordinary school mornings with the extraordinary weight of a famous last name. His son faced repeated prosecution in the 2000s. Witnesses from inside the life took the stand against him, saying he had kept a hand in rackets after claiming retirement. Juries split and could not reach verdicts. The government eventually stepped away. He gave interviews, wrote about his father, and said the cycle needed to end with his generation. Whether every listener believed him mattered less, finally, than whether younger family members chose different paths. The structure he once led adjusted multiple times. Acting heads served while trials played out. Relatives filled gaps and then went to prison themselves. By the 2010s, a quieter leader with deep Sicilian roots was said to hold the reins, emphasizing caution after a decade of high-profile collapses. A younger, low-wowkey figure gained influence, keeping a distance from press and avoiding the sidewalk court that had defined John's style. That cautious approach reflected a lesson learned across all the families. Attention is expensive, and cameras never help. Small artifacts of his era took on symbolic weight. The old club on Mulberry Street turned into a boutique, where tourists sometimes ask if the back room matched what they saw on screen. The steakhouse block where the 1985 ambush ended one chapter still draws curious passers-by who point to a curb and take photos. The cemetery in Queens where he rests receives visitors who leave notes and cheap cigars. In Queens, the Bergen storefront changed hands and became just another address to people who moved in later and knew the name only from cable documentaries. Cities recycle spaces. Only stories and names keep corners alive after the tenants change. The last years inside federal custody showed how far the world had shifted from the days of unbugged sit-downs. Administrators placed him in strict units, monitored movements, and limited contact when they suspected coded orders in innocuous phrases. He learned to husband his voice after cancer surgery and to measure words in visits so that nothing essential could be misread by staff or recorded as new evidence. He told relatives to stay out of the way of law enforcement, and he meant it as protection as much as strategy. Pride kept an edge to his sentences, but the man who once set schedules for whole crews accepted that the clock and the ward's routine no longer answered to him. He became a study subject for law schools and criminology programs. Professors walked students through transcripts and asked how a jury should weigh the word of a cooperator who admits to terrible acts. They examined the ethics of striking deals that shorten sentences for people who helped commit the very crimes the state wants to punish. They talked about the balance between privacy and public safety in the use of hidden recording devices. Students read opinions from appeals that cited established standards for wiretaps and the need for minimization to avoid recording privileged conversations. His case, once tabloid fodder, turned into a casebook example. His legacy, if you strip it of either worship or scorn, sits in 3 columns. There is the personal history. A kid from a large family who found status in a closed world and provided, fiercely, for his own while, exposing them to scrutiny and danger that never let up. There is the enterprise, a network that extracted money through threats and influence, steered major labor markets, and enforced silence with punishments that left families mourning. And there is the law enforcement response, a decades-long shift in tools and tactics that ended with life sentences for leaders who had believed themselves untouchable. Put together, those columns form a piece of modern New York history, as consequential as any political administration or financial boom. Other names circled his orbit and rose or fell on their own arcs. A powerful leader from another family, once thought beyond reach by many in the life, went to prison in the late 1990s after years of public eccentricity and careful defenses. A rival underboss who had teamed with him on a project and later turned, vanished into protection and then re-emerged in arrest sheets out west. A trusted non-Italian associate with a reputation as a closer served years after federal charges tied him to attempts to collect money and enforce orders. Union figures, once feared for their ability to stall skyscrapers, ended their careers behind desks in prosecutors' offices. recounting past deals to jurors born long after the 1970s heyday. Each of those stories braids with his, because that is what a network is. Many lives bent around a central gravity. Even the language shifted. The nicknames that sold papers in the 1980s faded from respectable outlets by the 2000s, replaced by neutral terms and careful qualifiers. Reporters wrote, "according to testimony," and prosecutors alleged more often. Editors grew wary of glamour. Advocates for victims pushed for context in every retelling. His supporters pushed back, accusing the press of swallowing the government's line whole. In that argument sat the old American tension about crime and punishment. How to tell the truth plainly without turning people who did real harm into anti-heroes. Time did its work on everyone connected to the story. His wife aged with quiet dignity, raising children who had already grown up under conditions strangers could barely imagine. Brothers and cousins faced their own reckonings, some in courtrooms, some in hospitals. Agents who had spent careers listening through static, retired and wrote memoirs, or met former counterparts from the other side on panels, where they argued politely about what mattered most. Younger prosecutors learned the old files, and then turned to newer threats. The storefronts changed tenants. The one-time center of Little Italy shrank as demographics shifted, and different migrant histories layered over older ones. In the spring of 2019, a startling headline linked the old name to the present when a quiet, business-minded leader of the retooled organization was shot outside his Staten Island home. Police later arrested a man whose motives had nothing to do with old feuds. The case underscored the point that the world John had shaped no longer ran on the same rules. Even violence that recalled another era did not follow that era's logic. The past can echo. It rarely repeats cleanly. For people who grew up near the Bergen Club, the memory that lasts is not a courtroom transcript, but a posture. He stood with shoulders back, as if a block belonged to him by natural right, and he carried that stance into rooms where money and fear met. He could be generous to a fault within his circle, sending help to families when someone went away, remembering birthdays, and giving cash to cover a hospital bill. He could be ruthless when he believed the enterprise needed it. Both qualities are true, held in tension that defined his life, and shaped the lives of many who crossed his path. He once told a friend, long before the cell and the medical ward, that respect mattered more than anything. In the end, the respect he valued most, the kind that comes from control, and the ability to decide other people's outcomes collapsed in a courtroom where the rules were different, and the tools finally matched the problem. The respect that persisted was smaller and more human. The love from family members who visited a tired man behind glass, the neighbor who remembered a quiet kindness, the child who grew up under the thunder and chose something else. If you walk past the old addresses today, the city offers few clues. A passerby looks at a storefront and thinks about coffee, not envelopes. A kid rides a bike, not knowing a detective once took photos from a car across the street. The stories live in archives and in the long memory of New Yorkers, a people who can argue politics for hours and still keep room for a tale that begins with a name and a corner. In that memory, John remains what he was in life to the city itself, a mirror that reflected both the pull of power and the cost of chasing it through rules that cannot endure. The years after his death turned the old scenes into echoes. On Mulberry Street, the door that once swung open to a crowded club became the entrance to a boutique where tourists browsed without realizing the upstairs rooms had changed a city's balance. In Howard Beach, people still put out folding chairs on warm evenings, but the man whose arrival once hushed a sidewalk was gone. Former agents compared notes at conferences and wrote chapters that described microphones hidden in places a younger version of themselves would never have imagined. Old associates kept their voices low when they met for coffee, trading memories of rules and mistakes, and the heavy cost of both. The record was fuller by then, and so were the questions. Reporters dug through transcripts and old case files. Lawyers who had fought him across a courtroom walked audiences through how enterprise prosecutions work, how you stitch together tapes, turncoats, bank ledgers, and union minutes into a single arc a jury can see. Teachers used the case to show why a wire with a court order is different from a hunch. The man at the center stayed frozen in photographs, a raised chin, a tailored coat, a stare aimed just past the cameras. That image sold papers. The paper trail behind it told a harsher truth about money made and pressure applied. His family lived under that spotlight in real time. His daughter opened the doors of her home for a television series that mixed everyday chores with the odd fact that her sons shared a last name strangers recognized. Viewers tuned in for teenage squabbles and kitchen talk, while critics debated whether entertainment washed away the harm that earlier years had set in motion. His eldest son faced an endless round of court calendars. After pleading in the late 1990s and saying he would step aside, he was charged again in the 2000s. Some trials hung when jurors could not agree. A case in Florida that reached back to old disputes ended with a mistrial. Eventually, prosecutors walked away. He wrote about his father and said he wanted a clean break. People who had grown up around the life argued over whether any break could ever be clean. Around them, the structure he had once directed kept changing shape. In 2008, a massive sweep hit dozens of figures tied to the same family: captains, soldiers, associates, in a coordinated action that reached into New Jersey and overseas. The charges read like a familiar catalog: gambling, loans, labor schemes, and violence used to retain control. It was a reminder that the old machine still turned, even if its engine no longer roared. Shortly after, a careful, media-shy leader took the top spot. He favored quiet over show, a lesson drawn straight from the fate of the Dapper Don era. A few years later, another soft-spoken figure with a reputation for business over bravado became the face of a calmer period. That relative calm shattered in 2019, when the man then seen as the family's day-to-day chief was shot outside his Staten Island home. Investigators soon said the suspect's motives were personal, not tied to any internal coup or interfamily plot. It was an odd modern footnote to an older story. A famous name collided with a new kind of chaos that ignored the old rules. Pop culture never stopped mining the legend. Books landed with competing theses. Some highlighted charisma and cautionary glamour. Others focused on victims, on union carpenters, docked extra cash every payday, on club owners who paid to keep doors open, on contractors pressured to accept bad terms or watch deliveries stall. Documentaries played grainy courtroom clips where jurors leaned in to hear recorded voices from the upstairs room above Mulberry Street. A later feature film offered a stylized version that drew sharp criticism from reviewers and from people who had lived the history. The best work, the material that lasts, made room for contradictions. Generosity to friends and ruthless decisions against perceived threats, neighborhood outreach, and systemic harm. The legal innovations that brought him down remained in use. RICO let the government tell a story bigger than any single act, to show how rackets fed each other, and how leadership decisions echoed from a cafe in Little Italy to a housing site in Queens. Courts refined the standards for hidden microphones, strict warrants, minimization to avoid capturing private conversations, careful chain of custody. Witness protection kept evolving too. The state made bargains with people who had done serious harm, and the public kept arguing about whether the trade was worth it. Even that debate looped back to him, because the most famous cooperator in his case later broke the law again and went back before a judge, a twist that angered families who had accepted the government's deal as a necessary step toward closure. His reach showed up in places people don't always expect. A parking garage below the World Trade Center is one example. In 1990, a soldier who ignored an order was found there dead in a case that later testimony laid at the leader's feet. That garage would be part of a far larger tragedy years later. History layers pain on pain. The city learned, once again, that most stories are complicated knots, personal choices, institutional systems, and random chance tied together. If you pull the camera back, his arc looks like a map of post-war New York in motion. A child of immigrants in a crowded apartment, a teen who learned to hustle, a young man who attached himself to a crew that hijacked cargo and ran numbers, a captain who leveraged loans, gambling, and construction influence. A leader who believed visibility proved strength. A prisoner who learned that visibility invites a different kind of attention. And finally, a patient in a medical ward, inside a system he could not bend. Along the way, he helped shape how unions operated on big sites, how some city contracts moved, and how lots of people understood power. He also helped shape how the law answered, with patient cases that took years to build and a willingness to flip the kind of witness earlier generations would have written off as too compromised to trust. The personal ledger stayed mixed to the end. He loved his children fiercely. He could be thoughtful, even tender, with relatives and close friends. He supported families when men went away, sent money for funerals, and called from payphones in prison to offer advice no one asked for but some still wanted to hear. He could also cut people off overnight if he felt disrespected. He could sanction outcomes that left empty chairs at holiday tables. He built a world where silence was safety and loyalty, the only currency that mattered, then watched as microphones and a friend's decision to testify made both feel like air. Not everything tied to his name fit the worst cliches. He was not a creature of clubs alone. He met bankers in quiet back rooms when needed. He had lawyers who guided him on where the lines looked from the other side and how to avoid crossing them. He read papers, kept track of local politics, and knew which city officials held levers that mattered to trucking, sanitation, or concrete. He once skipped a public event many thought he would attend because a single phone call told him attention would be too bright. He liked the stage, but he understood risk. What he misread was how technology and time had changed the stage lights. By the late 1980s, the glow he courted did not just charm, it illuminated. People close to the life still argue over why he pushed as far as he did in public. Some say it was personal style, pure and simple. He liked clothes, liked the respect that comes from recognizability, liked to feel like a neighborhood pillar. Others say it was strategy. By standing tall, he made people believe their money and safety were wrapped in his presence. In a world where perception can be 9/10 of power, that may have worked short-term. Long-term, it drew the attention that built the case. Old figures, quiet men who never posed, shook their heads. They lived long and died in bed. He chose a different path. The places linked to his story now carry footnotes. Sparks, the steakhouse near the December ambush, still serves dinner to people who remember the flash of sirens decades ago. The block is part landmark, part cautionary marker. The apartment above the old club became a symbol in legal textbooks. The upstairs bug, proof that careful surveillance can penetrate a culture built on whispers. The cemetery in Queens receives a flow of visitors who leave notes and cigar ends. Gestures meant to signal respect the way some people light candles at a shrine. In that ritual, you can see the competing versions of the past. A folk hero to some, the architect of pain to others. Ask a union carpenter from that era about the memory that sticks, and you might hear about envelopes that came off the top of paychecks and the relief when a long investigation finally cut the line that fed that tax. Ask a bookmaker who paid weekly, and you might hear about protection that felt like security until the day it didn't. Ask a cop who watched him come and go from the doorway on Mulberry, and you might hear about the quiet thrill of catching a clean recording after months of failures. Ask a neighbor from Howard Beach, and you might hear about a holiday donation to a local charity or a quick conversation on the sidewalk that felt like a blessing. Every answer is true to the teller. Even now, younger people find the story and ask if the myth matches the man. The simplest reply is that myths sand down rough edges. The real story has splinters. He mentored and menaced, built and broke, charmed and chilled. He saw himself as a guardian of a code. Courts saw him as the leader of an enterprise that earned through unlawful means and used fear to protect profits. Both can be held in mind at once, if you care more about clarity than about purity. There are practical lessons in the aftermath. City contracting rules changed, union oversight tightened. Task forces now pull in data analysts who map calls and money flows the way detectives once mapped foot traffic. Prosecutors still build cases one recording at a time, but they also read spreadsheets for patterns that a human ear might miss. Defense lawyers, for their part, challenge metadata and search protocols with a precision that didn't exist in the 1980s. The chessboard he once played on now has new pieces. For his family, the lesson was older and simpler. Fame is a cost. Children grew up watched, judged, and at times, hounded by people who wanted a quote or a slip. Some relatives leaned into the attention and built media careers. Others chose quiet and moved away. Weddings and graduations happened with the awareness that photographs might show up online under a headline none of them wrote. Grief became public whether they liked it or not. If you listen to late night radio in New York, callers still tell stories about him in the hour before dawn. A driver who delivered produce to a restaurant once saw him tip a porter more than a week's pay for a favor. A retired court officer remembers the silence in a hallway as a jury filed in with verdicts that felt inevitable only in hindsight. An old bookmaker remembers a knock on a door that sounded polite, but meant business. A former prosecutor says the day the tapes played to a jury was the day the room changed. In the end, the most durable frame may be the simplest. A boy from the Bronx hated the feeling of being small. He found a system that promised control, status, and a way to take care of his own. He gave that system everything, and it gave back money, respect from a certain crowd, and the illusion that rules didn't apply if you had enough nerve. Then time, technology, and law met at a single point and moved him from a club door to a cell. He spent his last years tracing the route backward in his head, telling loved ones to be smarter and calmer than he had been, and asking for news from home. The city does not keep shrines forever. Time folds one layer over another, and people walk past old addresses without knowing what they meant. Yet the name lingers in conversations, in classrooms, in news retrospectives that splice together a smile on courthouse steps and a chain of court filings that ended in a life sentence. After the burial in Queens, the story did not stop. It kept branching. Families coping, investigators finishing careers, writers shaping memory, and younger faces learning caution from a past they didn't live. In the years that followed, the inner circle scattered into endings that said as much about the era as any headline. Frank Locascio, who had sat to John's right in the upstairs apartment, and then at the defense table, served decades and died in custody in 2021. Peter Gotti, the steady brother who shouldered responsibility after Junior's plea and tried to keep the organization on course without spectacle, also passed away in federal prison that same year. Gene Gotti, the brother who had absorbed a long narcotics sentence in the late 1980s, came home in 2018 an older man in a quieter borough, watched by agents who never quite close a file. Salvatore Gravano, whose testimony broke the code of silence and helped seal the 1992 verdict, served a separate stretch out west after a new arrest tied to a club drug ring. He was released years later and re-emerged as a public voice, a development that reopened old wounds for families who had accepted his deal as a necessary step. Each outcome stitched another line into the ledger that began decades earlier in East New York and Ozone Park. On the streets that once felt like a stage, the air changed. Leaders who followed chose different approaches. Some took the lesson of visibility to heart and kept a small footprint. One careful figure with Sicilian roots steered the family into the 2010s by trading swagger for caution, living by the idea that attention was a cost, not a currency. Another low-profile organizer leaned into business-like routines and stayed off front pages. None of that meant the machine stopped. Gambling, usury, and labor leverage remained profitable, if thinner. Federal cases in 2008 hit dozens at once, pairing New York indictments with arrests in Italy, proof that cross-Atlantic ties were still real and that cooperation between agencies could bend old patterns. A decade later, in 2019, the unexpected shooting of a sitting figure outside a Staten Island home jolted the city. Police arrested a lone suspect whose motives, they concluded, had nothing to do with succession or interfamily plots. Even violence that looked like a throwback refused to fit the old script. The legal system kept using the playbook refined during John's rise and fall. RICO cases grew more sophisticated, pulling in forensic accounting, wire data, and digital messages alongside the old tools of surveillance and informants. Warrants for hidden devices had stricter minimization protocols. Judges scrutinized how investigators avoided privileged conversations. Juries heard cleaner audio than the Ravenite tapes, but the principle stayed the same. Show pattern, not isolated events. Show leadership, not just hands on a task. Defense lawyers, trained on past defeats, pressed new angles metadata, chain of custody in the digital era, the credibility of repeat cooperators. Prosecutors countered with corroboration from bank records, cell site hits, and quiet insiders who had never appeared in tabloids. The chessboard that John once read by streetlight now included tools he never had to face. His family tried to live ordinary days under a name that guaranteed the opposite. His widow carried on with the reserve of someone who had weathered storms in private. His daughter, already a public figure, continued writing and occasionally invited cameras into a home that mixed PTA meetings with the weight of a surname people felt licensed to judge. His eldest son's later courtroom battles ended without convictions, when juries split more than once and the government let the case go. He talked about leaving the life, about raising children away from the trap of reputation, about how cycles should end. Whether every listener believed him mattered less in the long run than the choices his children made. Some relatives leaned into media, crafting narratives of their own. Others moved farther out, choosing silence and distance over any echo of the old script. On the city's grid, the legacy of the construction rackets he had helped manage washed through in reforms. Monitors embedded in unions tightened oversight. Procurement rules adopted conflict of interest checks that made bid rigging harder to hide. Inspectors carried body cameras to keep meetings clean. A foreman's no to an unapproved delivery now had institutional backing that didn't exist decades earlier. Not every fix stuck, and not every office did its job, but the space for the kind of club that once split concrete contracts shrank under audit trails and shared databases. The quiet tax on job sites that had felt like a law of nature to carpenters in the 1980s became, for many, a story told by older hands. Memory kept stubborn details alive. The Howard Beach accident that shattered a family in 1980 remained the private center of their grief, long after rumor and fear had faded from neighborhood talk. The December evening outside the Midtown Steakhouse, which shifted power in an instant, turned into a caution in law enforcement circles about how quickly a generation can rewrite rules. The Ravenite's upstairs apartment, with its clatter of cups and coded talk, showed new investigators the value of listening not for the grand pronouncement but for the unguarded aside. The 1992 courtroom, where tapes played and a former ally spoke, taught prosecutors to build cases that matched what jurors can hold in their heads: faces, voices, money flows, outcomes. There were smaller ripples, the kind that don't make documentaries. A shop owner who once paid to keep weekend card games running now renewed a license through a city portal and left a note on the bill that made him smile. A retired union treasurer, who had carried the weight of 2 ledgers in the 1980s, watched his grandson apprentice on a site where the hardest conversation was about safety gear and start times. A former agent ran into a one-time target at a coffee counter on the Upper East Side, nodded, and went on with his day. The city that had once felt like a chessboard contested by a handful of powerful men felt, to those people, more like a place where institutions mattered more than personalities. There were also stubborn continuities. Sports betting never stopped. It moved onto phones. Loans at predatory rates never disappeared. They found new faces and new ways to coerce. Some of the same neighborhoods still held back rooms where envelopes changed hands, even if the handshakes were more careful and the doors better soundproofed. The lesson older captains drew from the Gotti years, the danger of conflating celebrity with strength, competed with the internet's gravitational pull. Even people who believed attention was poison could not entirely ignore a world that rewards visibility. The smarter ones remembered the upstairs bug. As for the man at the center, the postscript remained complicated. To people in the neighborhood who had known him in ordinary moments, he could be the father who insisted bills were paid on time, the neighbor who showed up for a fundraiser, the friend who sent cash quietly when a kid needed an operation. To families of men who never came home, he was the decision-maker who signed off on an outcome that took a son, a father, a brother. To union workers who lived through the club years, he was part of a system that skimmed from their labor. To prosecutors and agents who had faced him from the gallery or the sidewalk, he was the test case that proved a method. To the city as a whole, he became a symbol of a period when power wore silk in public and found itself cornered by patient tape and a witness who switched sides. It is tempting to smooth a life like that into a single lesson. He refused to be easily smoothed. He cared about appearances and substance, about loyalty and fear, about family and the business that endangered it. He read people well and read the changing technology poorly. He understood the importance of ritual inside his world and misjudged how little it would matter when a jury sat down to decode it with guidance from an insider. He believed he could take the weight, and did, until forces bigger than will law, time, illness closed in. If you retrace the arc, the plot points still line up. A childhood of cramped rooms, a teenager drawn to corner crews, an apprenticeship under a respected captain, a federal sentence that turned into reputation, the Staten Island kidnapping case that became a fatal confrontation and a plea, induction and a captain's chair at Bergen, airport scores and loans enforced on schedule, a friendship with Angelo Ruggiero that brought warmth and danger, Della Croce's mentorship and death, The breach with Castellano and the December ambush. Frank DeChico's killing and the pressure that followed. The Ravenite years of public presence. The O'Connor case and an acquittal. The Windows prosecutions and Armon's fall. The upstairs microphones. The 1,990 arrest sweep. Gravano's decision. The 1,992 verdict. Marion's concrete routines. The cancer ward. A funeral, under watch. Every later Echo Jr.'s cases, Peter's stewardship, Gene's release, Gravano's second fall, the Staten Island shooting rings off those points. For people who want to know what changed because of him, the answers sit in policy and culture. Law enforcement agencies embraced long cases, accepted the politics of flipping feared insiders, and learned to explain coded language to juries without slipping into invention. Unions and contractors built internal checks that, while imperfect, made some old shortcuts harder. Journalists shifted from glamour shots to deeper, sometimes duller, reporting on how money moved and whom it hurt. Families, his and others, saw that reputations can be traps and that the spotlight is a tax as heavy as any envelope. What did not change is also worth saying. The hunger for shortcuts did not disappear with any one conviction. Every city has people ready to trade risk for faster results, to ignore rules if a nod from the right person seems available. The best use of a story like this is to make the cost plain, to leave less room for myth. The cost ran through courtrooms, hospital rooms, living rooms where kids watched a parent leave for years, job sites where workers paid a hidden surcharge, and neighborhoods that learned to lower their voices. People still visit his grave. Some leave a cigar. Some say a prayer. Some come out of curiosity and leave with more questions than they brought. A few blocks away, a bakery sells espresso to tourists who have no idea a federal squad once celebrated across the street after finally getting a clean recording. That is how cities work. Memory and amnesia, side by side. If there is a quiet ending to be found, it is this. In a city that prides itself on invention, John Gotti tried to reinvent a role by making it visible. He turned a closed world into front-of-page theater and, for a while, bent public attention to his will. He provided for his own and exacted a price from many others. He was confident until confidence could not carry him. The law, patient and sometimes plotting, met him where he lived literally, in the rooms above a club, and brought him to a place where the only schedule that mattered was the one printed on a prison wall. He died there, far from Mulberry Street, and the city kept breathing. Late at night, when the avenues are quieter and the lights from apartment windows look like a sky flipped upside down, a person can stand near the old addresses and think about all the forces that crossed in one life. Ambition and fear, pride and love, money and power, rules of a club and rules of a court. The echo that remains is not the tabloid nickname or the courtroom sketch. It's the reminder that no one outruns the sum of their choices forever, and that the stories we tell about power are clearest when they include who paid for it. Then the light changes, the crosswalk chirps, and the city moves forward, as it always does, carrying a memory that belongs to everyone who lived under its spell. And so, the story of John Gotti drifts back into the silence of history, his empire rising and falling like all those before him. Power, respect, and fear may have shaped his world, but tonight, it's just another tale carried gently into the night. Thank you for joining me here on The Silent Empires. If you found peace in this story, remember to subscribe and share where you're listening from. It helps this quiet empire grow. For now, close your eyes, let the noise of the day fade away, and rest easy. Good night.